My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director for the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. As we begin the fourth season of Religion and, we continue to find questions about religion and American culture at the center of public conversations as we simultaneously face increasing polarization that threatens the possibility and promise of healthy discourse. The Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture is uniquely positioned to facilitate discussions on the relationship between these cultural shifts, the study of religion, and the role of the modern scholar and teacher. For over 30 years, this center has brought together scholars and practitioners to engage religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our fields, on our campuses, and throughout our society. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics, activists, and public thinkers hosted by the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture to continue these critically important interventions. Today, we are opening the fourth season of Religion and our session is entitled Religion and the Public Intellectual. This is a session and an opportunity to hear from scholars who have placed themselves in the center of political, cultural, and really world-changing firestorms, not only based on the content of their scholarship, but also their method and the format of their work. This season, we plan to continue to look across religious traditions, methods, and to invite thinkers and practitioners who are doing work on the leading edges of these discourses and interventions, and how these topics impact our research, our teaching, and our work beyond the university. This year, we are really excited because in addition to having these conversations once a month, we're also asking these scholars to share their resources and materials with us as a part of our show notes so that you can come back to these conversations and learn a little bit more about these topics, to think in deeper and in greater depth about what some of them have brought up, and to share these with your students and your community members as we look forward. As we have done through all of our previous seasons, all of these videos and all of the materials will be uploaded to our website, and they will also be available through our YouTube channel. As we think about the last couple of years, the university, its curricula, and its responses to ongoing ideological debates, we have and continue to be under an intense microscope. This has impacted a lot of people, but especially it has impacted the scholar whose work intersects with politics, activism, and community engagement. And so for this episode and for today's conversation, I'm so excited because we have a group of scholars who are doing the work, that are engaged and involved and participating in these politically fraught moments, but are doing them in creative, thoughtful, and robust ways. And so our panelists are going to talk to us from a number of different perspectives. One, about how they got connected to these communities, how they have decided to do the particular work that they are doing, and how and in which ways we can continue to broaden and expand these kind of conversations. So I'm excited that you have joined us for a conversation at the intersection of religion, activism, and the role of the public intellectual. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit their questions and their comments through the Q&A function on Zoom. You know, I know that there's a chat that you might be able to see or use, but if you want to submit a question that we can engage and pass back and forth through the panelists, please submit that through the Q&A function. That will enable me and your panelists to engage those questions and to facilitate this very important conversation. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists for today and move into what I'm hoping is going to be a fantastic conversation this afternoon. First of all, I would like to introduce a friend of mine and a colleague, Dr. Monique Moultrie, who is an associate professor of African Studies and Religious Studies at Georgia State University. Her scholarly pursuits include sexual ethics, African-American religions, and gender and sexuality studies. Her research has been supported by a number of granting organizations, from the Ford Foundation from the Wabash Center to her Dean's Early Career Award at Georgia State University. I'm most excited, and I'm sure many of you have read her work and seen her talk, but I'm most excited about her most recent book, even though I love and have used her first book, Passionate and Pious: Religious Media and Black Women's Sexuality, that was published in 2017 by Duke University Press. But her most recent book is Hidden Histories: Faith and Black Lesbian Leadership and and it is a tour de force and a powerhouse, and I can't wait for us to discuss some of that today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Monique Moultrie. Our next panelist is Dr. Mira Sukharov. Is that correct, Mira? Dr. Mira? She is a professor of political science at Carleton University. She's the author of a number of books, including Borders and Belonging, a memoir that just came out in 2021, Public Influence, a guide to op-ed writing and social media engagement, and The International Self, Psychoanalyst and the Search for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. She does a lot of work in both the academic, the public, and in the social media spaces. She's currently writing a dual travel memoir with one of her colleagues on space, place, and emotion in Israel and Palestine. And they are developing, and I don't know if it's already ready, a podcast on the past and future of Jaffa called The Vacant Lot. And so I'm so excited to have Mira here with us today and to join us in this conversation. And last and definitely not least is my colleague who is literally just down the hall from me, just a few doors down, Dr. Andrew Whitehead, who is an associate professor of sociology and the director of the Association of Religion Data Archives here at IUPUI. Dr. Whitehead is one of the most foremost scholars of Christian nationalism in the US, and he is the lead author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which is an award-winning text that he wrote alongside Dr. Samuel Perry. His latest book, which I'm excited about again for today and that we're going to talk a little bit about, is American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. We've seen Dr. Whitehead all over and throughout campus and in a number of different media. He just won one of our Trailblazer Awards here on IUPUI's campus, and he just started a new podcast that he might talk a little bit about during today's conversation. But I am so excited to have Andrew, Mira, and Monique here today for such an important conversation. So everybody out there, give it up for the people. And I want us to jump right in if y'all don't mind. Is that okay? Does that sound good to everybody? So I wanted to start off by talking about the title of this panel. You know, I reached out to Andrew and I said, Andrew, I want to do this panel on, religion and, these kind of topics and engaging with these kind of controversial topics in the American public and the American media. But I want to look at it through the lens of the public intellectual, right? And so something that was going to be broader than just, again, only talking about white Christian nationalism, but bringing that into a broader conversation. Israel and Palestine, CRT, LGBTQIA issues that are happening around the country. And so we decided on a title that was Religion and the Public Intellectual. But I wanted to ask you all to start off and say, does that term public intellectual do the work that we needed to do? Is it useful? Is it capacious enough? Is it helpful in thinking about who you are and what you do? Or is there a better word or a better term that explores and expresses what you do as a scholar, right on that border of religion and activism and the broader culture? I'm gonna start with Monique, but I want everybody to jump in and answer this question. So Dr. Moultrie.
Sure. So I think you named for me what is most accurate for me. In the last year, I've done more public facing work. But for the most part, I see it as a part of my identity as a scholar activist. I'm much more likely to use that term than I would public intellectual. And I am intentional about that because I believe part of my goal as a scholar is to empower and inform and to do so in community. And for me, sometimes public intellectuals are persons who have a PhD, who have some learning, who have a platform, but who may not necessarily be in conversation with the communities that they are speaking for. And so I also do it to reject, I am a proud member of the Black church. And so I do that to reclaim my identity in the Black church space, to say that that is an activist space for me. And these are the communities for me that I hold near and dear, but the ones that pay my bills, that keep me in the capitalist enterprise, demand less overt engagement with topics. And so I think public intellectual is a new catchphrase of like, how do we report what we're doing to the higher ups who care? Where were you? Like literally yesterday, I got something from the university warning. I mean, it went to every faculty member warning about using your time to other entities, other enterprises, and not letting the university know. And there's a little form you're supposed to fill out every time you do this. That for me is kind of the work of public intellectualism, not to denigrate it, but to say it is work. It's just not work that I identify with. I think the last thing I'll say is, for me, why scholar activist identity fits more is I've been speaking quite a bit in the last year about understanding the difference between academic cowardice and strategic interdependence. And so for me, the best public intellectuals know how to thread this needle to support people in vulnerable positions while not speaking for them. And that I think comes more naturally to scholar activists, but I do see public intellectuals that can do that work. So I'll stop there.
Mary, you want to jump in?
Sure. I really loved how Monique put it all. So I really identify with that. I think the one thing I would add, and I often use the term scholar activist as well to describe myself and to describe encouraging others, let's say graduate students who I'm training or undergraduate students who I'm training, to think about themselves in that way, to think about the kinds of contributions they can make more broadly to conversations based on the knowledge that they're gaining and sharing that knowledge. I guess one thing I would say, two things. One thing is just to really emphasize the idea of conversation. When I think about the term public intellectual, I think of someone standing at a lectern and talking in a very unidirectional sort of way and sharing knowledge from on high. And I'm much more, I think, like Monique expressed it, much more interested in conversations and having that dialogue always be foregrounded. And then the other thing is just in terms of hubris, I mean, if someone wants to call me a public intellectual, I won't stop them, but I feel a little maybe shy about adopting that term, because I think that's sort of in the eye of the listener. And is someone really learning from me, then wonderful. I'm thrilled.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think for me, the journey has been one where, being trained in sociology and then trying to use those tools to understand, our social world, what's happening, whether it's politics or broader society in the US. And then, happening upon this particular strain of research and trying to understand, what it tells us that's new. And then, for me and my work with Sam Perry and others, just then starting to lean into this desire to translate some of that work outside of our peer-reviewed outlets, where, those are places where we build ourselves as an academic and, because we want to get hired and keep a job and all of those things. So we have to do these things. And it's rewarding in one way, but, as we all kind of joke, you publish a peer-reviewed article and you wonder if 30 people will read it or whatever else. And two, I think for me, and I don't want to speak for anybody else that I've worked with, but I think this is true of them as well, where you spend all this time doing this work, and to then just let it sit and not try to speak to a broader audience or to, help us all understand better what's happening around us. And I think that's some of what motivated me and still motivates me, because I think with this topic that I'm working on with Christian nationalism over the last 10 years or so, what's been rewarding is hearing from those outside of academia that it helps them make sense of what's happening around them, that this term and this framework helps them understand more of, around the Thanksgiving table, what's going on, or in their congregations, let's say. And so I think, I guess my hope and what I would, encourage others too in the academy toward is not necessarily striving for this label of public intellectual, but that we do important work that in a number of ways for many of us is at least partially funded, publicly funded. And so trying to take that next step of translating that and helping hopefully speak into broader conversations for the good of our communities and those around us. I think what becomes difficult then is whether or not that is rewarded or even, given space for us to do as scholars within our institutions. I think a lot of times, I know I and others have thought, well, we do this, but it seems kind of extra. It isn't something that's directly rewarded in some ways. And so, we can talk about that. But I guess for my journey, and I think as I think about these things, it's, people are doing important work. And so then taking that next step to try and translate it and speak to a little bit broader audience as much as we can, or at least working on those skills. I think that's a part of hopefully what we see ourselves doing, or at least that's how I view being academic, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom. I think it's important to try and speak into some of these broader conversations.
I love this, and I want to go back to something, Monique, Dr. Moultrie, you pointed out in your comments. I think you all are talking about this. These are risks, in certain ways, right? And all of you all here have particularly achieved some status and some support in the institutions that you're at, and so you can take some of these risks. So I want to talk about this category of academic cowardice, right? How do you overcome that if it is something that you struggled with or that you see? And then how does this translate to your relationship with other folks that you're working with that don't have the protection maybe of the university or of tenure, right? When you're talking to grad students, when you're talking to your undergrads, even when you're talking to the other activists that are on the ground, right? How do you, kind of translate the risk that you're taking to these other communities? And what is your suggestion or your advice to them as they engage in some of this work? You want to jump in, Monique? I'll start with you because you use the term academic cowardice, and I want
Yeah. So the first thought that comes to mind is that I just do the work, and for me, what has changed is a shift in the visibility of me doing the work. I've always done the work. I just did it behind the scenes. I started interviewing LGBTQ religious leaders in 2009 when I was a doctoral student. When I had no power, no position, no authority in any way. And I did the work because the work needed to be done. And the interviews went up on the LGBTQ RAN website, and that's where they lived. I didn't put it on my CV. It wasn't work that I claimed. I just did the work because these people were dying and their stories were going to be lost to the ages. In my work with abortion activism, I live in Tennessee part-time, and in 2014, Tennessee made constitutional an abortion ban in our state constitution. And so I worked with RJ groups across the state in faith organizing and in trying to not get this amendment to pass. So I did the work. I didn't do it as Dr. Moultrie. I didn't do it as faculty member at X institution because I couldn't and keep my employment. So I think my best advice is where you're led, do that work, but also be sensible about it. So what I call strategic interdependence is me knowing when and where it's effective for me to be there as Dr. Moultrie, and when that cost is too high. So for example, the book Hidden Histories was making its way through the pipeline. It was coming out, and I recognized that that was going to be a problem for my husband, who was seeking a candidate for pastoring in Black Baptist spaces. The fact that I had written a book that basically says the future of the Black church is queer. That's going to be an issue. So we had some, career conversations about, well, what does this mean to advance one's career in light of someone else's career? Because that's how I saw the risk that I was taking. But I think time and conversation and strategically understanding when I was using what hat I was putting on, The result of that, though, is yet to be seen. I mean, truthfully, 2022 upended all the Fs I had to give. I had achieved tenure, so I thought I had some protections, but Roe fell, my husband died. Like, I didn't have much left to lose. If they were gonna come get this job, okay. I really, that's the space I was in. And so when I said like my public facing work has quadrupled in 2022, it really was because I stopped putting on different hats. I was just like, you know what, this is exhausting. I'm just going to do what I have to do. But 2023 is a different year. I'm putting in my packet for full professor. I had to make those decisions again. What do I include? I have this whole abortion and religion project. Do I put that down as my scholarship? Do I say to people, I'm interviewing people who've terminated and I'm talking to them and I've got a whole grant making, system behind this. Do I count that? So to me, it's just being strategic, but also while you're thinking that through, do the work. That's my thought.
Andrew, Mira?
I think I want to think a bit about when you said risk taking. There's a very powerful set of risks there, and I'm thinking also I can add a couple of them. Well, I would also build on the tenure and promotion. I'll start with the tenure and promotion question. I think it's important insofar as we are able, if we value public work and public conversations as something integral to our positions. I think it's incumbent upon us to help pluralize our workspaces, and when there are opportunities to revisit the benchmarks at our respective institutions for tenure and promotion, to try to push the needle towards inclusivity. And so that it's not that we want, I would ever urge any of us to say that all my colleagues must be more public facing, but to include public facing and to say that counts towards our contributions. And so the more we can do that, the more it will help not only our work, but others who we're trying to inspire. So that's on the more narrow university institutional level. And in terms of costs, the other thing for me is the community in which, I work in two communities, I guess, the Jewish community and the Jewish diaspora community, the Palestinian diaspora community, and then the three communities, I guess, and then the site of Israel-Palestine itself, that geographic space, which also includes many people. And some of those communities have a lot of overlaps. And at different times in my career, depending on stances I've taken and forums I've engaged in, including social media, different members of different kinds of communities have reacted, sometimes very positively and sometimes very negatively. And so there can be all sorts of emotional and political costs, including, in my case, family members, not my immediate family, thank goodness, not my parents or my spouse or kids, but a bit farther afield, have, let's say, an aunt, for example, have cut me off due to a certain stance, or others on Twitter, let's say, or on social media have reacted very negatively. And it's also worth looking at where does it sting most? And if you feel hurt from certain directions, it's sometimes a way of understanding yourself and understanding your politics, and who do you want to be seen as allies. And so if someone you thought was an ally is turning against you, what does that then say about the direction or the message that you want to deliver more effectively?
I love this. I love this conversation, and I want to keep pushing down here. And there was one of the questions that I sent to you all early, and one of them is about the shift that many of you all made, and I'm talking about Andrew, Monique, and Mira, and your work to a different kind of genre in certain degrees, right? And Andrew, I'll start with you on this one, right? Because when people read, I don't know if everybody on this conversation has read your first book. It's a very traditional sociological study that is looking at statistics and kind of the history of white Christian nationalism. But then when we look at this latest book that you've just put out, right, you're doing something else. You're explicitly talking to a different audience. And the same thing, Mira, in the work that you've done in your memoirs and in some of the other kind of blog posts and articles that you've written. These are not traditional academic texts, right? So I want to talk about how you decide what's the tone, what's the genre. And Monique, going with Duke University Press, in some ways, we can get to that, gave you a little bit of flexibility in terms of genre, because I think Duke is doing some important work in that regard. But I want to think about how you decided to write differently, if that's the right term, right? Or to think differently about the audience that you're writing to. So Andrew, jump us off from there. Like, what was it like to make that decision? Do you feel like it's been successful? And what do you hope is the outcome as a result of talking to this different audience or talking to them in a different way?
Yeah, I'm I can just speak to kind of my own journey on this. I think part of opening up the space maybe for this latest book is having done the work that came before, right? I think it has to follow in some sense that track where within the boundaries of the field, learning those methods and publishing in those places and doing that work to make a case for the importance of this topic. I think that's a key part of it, and having done that and learned to write in that way, I think is important. And two, just the journey of academia, the book, this most recent book isn't something that I would have been able to write or should have been working on, earlier on. I think it's something that had to come later. And part of that is just, where I was at professionally. And then I think too, some of this book where I'm writing to a particular audience, speaking to American Christians, and then too, bringing out just, where I am and who I am, and integrating some of that professional journey and some of that personal journey as a person that identifies as a Christian, and bringing together the evidence that I and others have been involved in, producing about specifically Christian nationalism, and recognizing, for me as an academic, but then as a person, that I'm still an actual person that lives in the United States, is interested in the common good and flourishing, and seeing how Christian nationalism threatens some of those democratic values, but then also too, as a Christian, then taking that next step in this book and saying, I think it actually threatens, expressions of Christianity that could be, focused on the common good, and how can we think through that. And so I think it just takes some of that journey and those kind of waypoints leading up to that to be able for me to feel comfortable doing that. That's been my personal kind of journey on it, because I'm not a trained theologian or anything like that. And so this, type of writing and some of those normative claims are outside the field that I work in academia. But I think as a person that lives and works and is a part of, a community here and is interested in hopefully, like with many of us, the common good within the United States, it got to the point where I felt like I could try to speak to this group specifically, this audience, as somebody that identifies with that audience and group, and try to share a bit of my own story, but then to professional story. So that's how, it came together for me, the pieces that I kind of put together, and wanting to, do what I could in this moment, to speak to what I've, studied, discovered, and then come to believe in. And I think, that's, something that I thought was important and at a good time for me.
I want to push you one more step, Andrew, and then I'll go to Monique and Mira. Really, how has that audience responded? Right, like, have you heard back from this abstract American Christian group, right? These white nationalists that maybe are reading, or some adjacent group that's engaging this book. Have you heard back, and like, what does it mean to now have, or to think about a more direct communication with that group? And I think that relates also to Monique and to Mira, because I think in some ways, Monique, it's always funny to me, and I was just point this out there, that or it's sad to me that we're still talking about oral histories as a radical intervention, but like hearing Black lesbian women's voices still in the form of oral history still feels like something that we're not doing enough of, that we don't have as a part of the archive, right? And so to hear, I want to know, have you heard back from them, as they've read, or other folks have read this last work of yours? But Andrew, like, talk to me first, like, what have people said? What has been the response?
Yeah. Well, and I think one reason that I felt comfortable too moving into this book or doing this work was the response to our first book, in that Christians across the spectrum, political, religious spectrum, were reading it and finding it useful and in providing a framework. And so then a lot of the questions I would receive if I was going to give talks or whatever else was like, well, what do we do now? Or what's next? And that isn't something that, social scientists really are about, right? That isn't something explicitly that we do. But I think then it came to a point where, as a person myself, thinking through, well, what do I think is important? And then making that a part of it. So, the book came out, like 3 or 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. So it's hard to say exactly, but, in the number of kind of podcast interviews and different things, I have been encouraged where there are folks that will even come into it explicitly and say, hey, listen, I know we probably voted differently in the last election, let's say, but I do want to, work through this, wrestle through this with you. And that's the tone and the, that I wanted to take in the book. And that folks that probably see things quite differently than me, both religiously and politically, are willing to wrestle through some of these things and to have a conversation, and not just for conversation's sake, but to really think through the implications of it. And, I'm grateful for that. I think that's my hope. Now, there are folks maybe that feel as though, I should have come down harder or done more or whatever. Those are just choices that I think every person has to make as they do this work. But for this moment in time and what I was trying to do, I'm encouraged that folks that, would think that they're probably very different from me across a number of things, are willing to engage with the work. And so that's my hope.
Thank you. I want to jump to Monique and to Mira, because, Monique, I want you to talk a little bit about, like, hearing back and giving a voice to this community and what that has meant. And what do you see as the next step in this project in some ways, right? Where do you go from this? And I think this is always the question for, folks that are now, not only does the academic have expectations for you, or the academy have expectations for all three of you or all of us, but I think now these communities that you are now speaking to, speaking for, speaking with, have expectations. Like, I expect Dr. Monique or Dr. Moultrie, whatever, however they respond to you, to do something now, right? Now that she said, hey, I've heard you, I've written about your voices, I've written about your stories, but tell me how that's unfolded for you.
Yes, well, like Andrew, the book came out in March, so I'm just now speaking about it. So more will be seen. But the June Pride Month volley of speaking engagements has been really positive. And what I've used is the opposition to help me find my people. So if this group is pissed off, then that means I have struck a nerve. Let me go be in allyship with the people they also pissed off with. Because if they pissed over here with this group, that means they probably my people. And that type of collaborative strategy has been really useful in helping me find less toxic spaces. Sometimes the academy can be really oppressive for a variety of diverse topics. And I've really welcomed these spaces that have pushed me, that have not we don't want you talking for us. Okay. And I made a commitment when I wrote the book with the publisher that half of the book had to be transcript words. I wanted half of the words to be the LGBTQ community. And when I decided the book was going to be all lesbians, half of the words in the book, and in fact, over half, are direct quotes from their transcripts, because that they're the story. I'm the analysis, but they are what I'm pointing the flashlight towards. And I think in spaces where I've been clear, I realize as an ally, I am stepping over some lines, but let me tell you why. That has been useful and generative and fruitful. And I will say, this is the other thing I've learned. They want you to be an ally at all times. Don't just write the book and then this was that thing I did. When we call you up, we want you on our board. We want you to donate. We want you to speak. We want you to do this. And it's not just for LGBT causes. We're trying to get a playground. We're trying to get a food bank. Like they have a diversity of needs, and being in community means caring about those things too. And that I think I knew, but I know differently now.
Yeah.
What being in community, sustained community means.
Yeah. Mira, can you jump in here? I want you to answer that question, about, writing a memoir, kind of going, talking about the your particular relationship to Palestine and Israel. But I also want us want us to talk a little bit about, just like the cost and the shift that comes alongside having these kinds of words out in the public space. Because I do want also people to realize that as Andrew and Monique are talking about this, these are also really politically fraught topics, and especially yours as well, Mira, as you're thinking about folks have died and lost lives and, been under attack because of this kind of because of their identity, but also because of their writing and their positionality. So talk a little bit about what does it mean to put your whole life out there in some ways, in the form of a memoir, right?
I think for me, when I think about this, is a really wonderful sub-thread here of the conversation. I think that the memoir, perhaps even unconsciously, was a way of neutralizing some of the intense negative reaction I'd received from my earlier incarnation, which had been dozens and dozens of op-eds. And often those were placed in Israeli or Jewish publications. And so that created not only a Jewish readership, but also others who are interested in Israel-Palestine. And an op-ed writing is a very different voice. It's persuasive writing, of course, and it's very terse, concise, tight. Even then, because I was a regular columnist in Haaretz, the Israeli daily, because I had a regular spot, I was able to bend the genre a little bit and include a little bit of my own subjectivity. But by the time I got to the memoir, I really wanted to peel the veil back. And I really wanted to say, well, this is what goes into becoming a public intellectual or scholar activist. And so some of the heat that I'd received, particularly some very uncomfortable moments, emotionally, politically, even a little bit fearing for my safety at times, from a very right-wing group in Canada, which is kind of quite a scary group, that ended up being material for the memoir. So in some ways, it's a way of becoming meta about this and looking at it from above. In other ways, it's my whole self, it's my whole psychology. It's what makes me tick and what makes me anxious and what makes me passionate and what makes me hurt. And I think that maybe unconsciously, that's maybe why I gravitated to that genre at that point in my life.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that so much. I want to encourage folks, we're getting to the last kind of quarter of this conversation. We're already at 3:40, but I wanted to encourage folks to drop questions in to the Q&A, to the question and answer component of Zoom. If you have questions or comments or thoughts to share with our panelists and thinkers and activists and scholars today, I wanted to kind of shift this conversation a little bit, if you will. And I want to go into this because there's two questions that I have, and I want to shift it, but I want to put both of them out because I'm being a little bit greedy right now. One is, I want to ask you a little bit about like how you learned to do what you did, right? Like, because on some level, how you learn to shift in your tone and your genre and your audience is, some people say it's a given, but I want y'all to be transparent, or as transparent as you can. How did your editors, did you take writing courses? Did you think differently about, the tone and the genre in order to reach these audiences, right? In a way, right? Like, how did you get this end goal, right? And I really do encourage folks to go out, and especially our scholars who are thinking about this, or graduate students who are on listening to today's conversation, to go out and read some of our panelists' work and the way in which they weave in, I think, politics, context, theory, and all of these in a very persuasive but also accessible voice. So one of my questions is, how did you learn how to do this? Really, like, how did you learn to write and think in this way, right? But the second one is, and I really want us to kind of think about this as we get some questions from folks, is really thinking about this question and concern about civil discourse being under attack, right? How do you learn how to write in a way that doesn't shut down the conversation, right? That doesn't close off a real debate and conversation? Because I think that some have argued that civil discourse or all types of discourse have been under attack. We're just screaming at each other and then we're running to our different corners of the room. How are you engaged in writing in a way that actually brings people out, right, to the conversation rather than causing them to turn back around and to double down on their thoughts and their ideas, right? So talk to me about it. I don't know who wants to start there, but talk to me about what you are thinking as it relates to that.
I can start. I've given that a lot of thought. Those are two great questions. So first on generating conversation that doesn't just force people to shut down or shut their eyes or their ears. Establishing common values is really key. So if when I'm writing a piece, what do we all care about, or what do we all pretend to care about at least? And then from there, building an argument that speaks to those commonalities. So that's been a technique I've used. Also, I try as much as possible, though I think I've been guilty of this at times when I look back over some of my short pieces, but to avoid snark, sarcasm, and rhetorical questions. So anything that makes the reader at all feel insulted is something I try to avoid. I haven't always been successful. In terms of learning the genre, when I was first asked to write an op-ed, it was for my local community paper many years ago. And I remember going onto Google and saying, how do you write an op-ed? And there really was very little on it. So then I wrote a book about how to write op-eds. So I learned, I wrote to learn and learned to write, but until I was asked by a publisher, University of Toronto Press, to write that book for my fellow scholars and other scholar activists and I define expertise widely. We're all experts at something in our lives. So how do we get our voice out into the public? So I studied a lot of op-ed writers whose voice I love, or who have a distinctive voice, and from there encouraged others to build a distinctive voice. In terms of the memoir, I read memoirs that I loved, and then I knocked on their doors. And I knocked on the door of Shulam Dean, who left ultra-Orthodox life and paid dearly for that exit. And I hired him to teach me. I also hired Alison Pick, another wonderful memoirist, and a little bit Ayelet Sabari. And they just taught me things that I'd known from as being a reader, but was really reluctant to do because it's not fun to write dialogue. It can be very onerous, but writing dialogue, setting scene, those techniques, I learned a lot. And the first draft did go into the incinerator. So I had that much to learn.
Yeah, I can kind of follow up with that. A similar experience where for me and some of the colleagues that I had worked with in writing peer-reviewed articles, moving into the op-ed or column space, really learning by doing and just trying. And so there was one outlet that is political scientists. And so those are, close enough disciplines to sociology to where they helped kind of structure writing for a broad audience and taking a paper, the main findings, and writing in a way that was engaging and presenting those. And so that was the first one. And so kind of, opening the hood up and just seeing how this worked, it was fun. It was a different type of writing. And so I think that's where it kind of started for me. And then working with journalists and editors that edit journalists, how they write and how they structure, a column is so different than peer-reviewed articles. And in many ways, I really enjoy it because it really does grab you, draw you in, and get to the point. And so those are things that I just had to learn by trying and doing and continuing to do. So I think that's a part of it, and encouraging, those who maybe are in different disciplines coming up, now, where I would say, yeah, you have to have the academic work kind of as the groundwork, but then don't ignore trying to move into some of these spaces as you have time, because it does allow you to speak to a broader audience. And again, if you do all this work and you think your work is important, which I hope we would if we spend this much time on it, then doing that next step of sharing it in a way that's accessible and helps speak to a broader problem. Because I think sociology has a lot to offer to help us understand who we are, where we're at, why we are, the way we are, all of those things. And so the more that we can write for those audiences, and I've been inspired by, a number of sociologists that are doing that work at levels that I'll never reach, but that I want to participate in. And so that's part of it, is just diving in, similar probably to peer-reviewed research, right? There's no perfect time to submit your first article. You just have to write it and do it. And so with this type of work, I've found that to be true too. So
I'll just throw out my names and we can go to questions.
Yeah.
I follow Brittany Cooper, and whatever she does, I'm like, I want to do that when I grow up. I think my earlier self thought when I was doing the PhD that I'd come out and be a Renita Weems, that I would speak to the Black church and Black women. And I've moved from that goal, but I still really, really like and really appreciate her work. And then I think, for me, when I think of public intellectual, I think of someone like Melissa Harris Perry, or someone who has the platform that they use to try to distill in very short amount of time, really complex things. And I just read today a random thing about Nobel Peace Prize winners and what has changed since they won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so for all of them, they said, like, I got bigger platforms and people asked me to be an expert on things that I knew nothing about because I won this award. And so what I'm really interested in is following people that speak in their platform, that speak to things they actually know about. Like, you don't want to hear me talk to you about childcare. Like, that ain't my wheelhouse. And I do sexuality, and sometimes that results in procreation, but like, I want to stay in my wheelhouse. So I'm really most excited when I'm reading people for the public, especially, that are in the genre from which they actually know a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate this idea. And I mean, I want to ask a question before we go to, just one last question before we go to some questions, from the audience. So drop them in the Q&A when you have a chance. But I do want to dig into this idea, though, is like, who are the collaborators or the partners as you are moving towards your next project? So I want to think a little bit about, like, how you are imagining, Monique as she's going to this next project and beginning to work beyond, and what is your relationship to the political and economic climate that we're currently finding ourselves in, right? Because I think that, like, one of the things that we haven't talked about, or that we're kind of skirting around, is that, like, tenure is under attack, right? In the state of Georgia, Monique, where you preside, that the way that we tell history is also being curtailed or constrained across this country. In Florida and Texas, pick the state, we can find a problem, right? How and what are you all doing or kind of thinking about as you move towards your next project and your next way of being, of engaging and being a public intellectual? I'll start with you, Monique.
You called out Georgia. So,
yes.
I've been ringing this alarm for a while. And I think that's the mechanism you have. You speak truth to power. You say, like, this is a thing. And on my campus, my courses early on were given over to the Georgia legislation that asked about divisive topics, people who were teaching about oppression and privilege and, that kind of thing. And so I've been very clear, like, this is a thing. Don't think it's an isolated thing. Look at Texas, look at Florida, like, put together the pieces. But I also have been raising the alarm and asking, what are you going to do? Are you going to adhere to my faculty contract? Are you going to scrub my physical address off the web for when the crackpots come? What is IT going to do with the hate mail I get anytime I publish about abortion and religion? I want them to know I have responsibilities and expectations that I expect from them as my employer. So you don't get to just say, oh, well, you did this brave, risky thing. Now live with the consequences. Like, I did. And what are you going to do? So for me, it's a both and, realize that, we're workers in the cog of the system, but the system still needs us.
Right.
So to use some of the resources from that system.
Yeah. I want to hear from Andrew or Mira, if you want to respond to that. We do have a question that's out here, and I think these are connected. So let's throw some of these out as we're going. It says, how do panelists, and I think this is going to be an interesting one, being scholarly activists, navigate the challenge of maintaining academic neutrality while teaching, right? Especially in the places that you all are located, and or in some of, especially Monique and Andrew in Indiana here, Monique in Georgia and Tennessee. And how do you address situations where students may begin to kind of attack or categorize or try to denigrate your work or your teaching as a part of university politics, right? So I guess the first thing is, how do you maintain that academic neutrality while teaching? Mira, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I don't. I like to distinguish between neutrality and objectivity. And now I'm going to really sound like a professor, like finally splicing terms. But I think to be objective is to appraise the situation in all its complexity and come to conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions may change. But neutrality is not something I think we need to have. Meaning, I think if we're talking about speaking truth to power, if we're talking about taking a stand on injustice, we're not being neutral. And I think that's okay. Now, our students may come to different conclusions about what justice looks like, and it's our role to help them decide what those are for their values. But I think as long as we're clear on our process, I think we're okay.
Andrew, have you faced that issue?
No, not explicitly. And that's probably due to a number of reasons, but I really like what Mira had to say, where being really clear on what this discipline has to offer them, and moving from empirical evidence and laying that out, and that we can come to different conclusions, but there is a point where the evidence is what it is, and we can look at the methods and the strengths and weaknesses of those studies, and then take that together. And I think what's key is helping them engage with that deeply, and do so with with an open mind, and being able to practice some of those aspects within the discipline, and kind of working on building those skills. But yeah, I think at some point too, there comes a point where being open about, and sometimes students will ask this, like, well, what do you think? And in that moment, I try to be open about where I fall with the evidence that's given, but doing it in such a way that, again, we're moving from that evidence, I think, is important. So that's what I think can differ, and how we can build classroom experiences that differ from maybe what they experience or what we experience on social media or elsewhere. That this is a place where there can be different beliefs, but we have to come and share and show kind of our work of how we have arrived at some of those, and whatever belief we're talking about or value too, being really upfront with why and how we hold that, and what type of evidence are we using and drawing upon to get to that moment. But I've often found, though, too, within the classroom, especially with students that I've had, where there will be some with very different beliefs and stances, but they do a good job of being able to talk through those, right, and to talk about those differences, and possibly have to reevaluate or at least challenge even their own thoughts, which I think that's the key. We want them to think deeply about why they believe what they believe, where they are, what they value. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to change or become like anybody else, but we can't just leave things unexamined. And so I think sociology, again, offers a lot of those skills that allow us to do that.
Yeah, and I think that, this is just my perspective. I think that, like, the liberal arts, the humanities, students are coming to the university for professors like you all. Like, they're coming to hear about a particular and creative intervention, right? And they are also wanting to learn, like Mira, as you said, how to parse out and frame their particular argument, whatever it is, whether they agree with you or not. But I think they want a passionate observer of the world that we live in, right? Not a dispassionate one, but somebody who is coming in with a particular way of engaging it. Now, we have a couple more questions. I wanted to get to this one, and I'll start with you, Monique. It says, and I'm interested in this because of you talk about your love and your commitment to the Black church, and it says, have you experienced backlash from your religious communities due to your work? And how so, and how did you respond to that? Like, and Mira, you can jump into that as well. But have you experienced the backlash, and what's your response to it?
Yeah, so I try to put myself in progressive spaces so that like they may be shocked, but they not like, oh, she really said that. But they're gonna roll with it. When I'm not in progressive spaces, how do I deal with the backlash? I go back to the scripture. I shake it off, the dust from my feet. And I go find my people. Like I have very little energy or tolerance for debating and dialoguing with someone whose existence requires my subjugation. And if I know that we don't have a middle ground because you require me to be less than my full self, life is too short. I'm a 45-year-old widow. I'm not spending no more hours, seconds of my day doing that. But I think for the most part, the work that I do, while people are like whispering about it, they are pulling me aside and saying, I'm so glad you came and you talked to us about so-and-so. And I jokingly say, like, I'm always a Women's Day speaker. I never am invited back twice. But my first time there, I'm going to give the people all of myself. And I am always met with, these are like my Facebook, invites grow exponentially afterwards. The pastor never invites me back, but the parishioners are like, hey, when a new book coming out? Like they're in my inbox.
It's been hard for me. It's definitely cost me some relationships, but I also do try to learn from the critique, maybe not in the moment, but if someone does issue a statement about me or to me that's unkind, I think the primary role I see myself is not having my own identity being subjugated, because I'm not in a position of fighting with anti-Semites, but my primary role is being an ally to those whose identity is very much subjugated. And that's what I would say would be my role within elements of the Jewish community who either consciously or either intentionally or inadvertently, maybe to be charitable, deny Palestinian humanity. And so for that, I keep my engines full, and I have a lot to give. And I know that even if my interlocutor isn't seeing things the way I see it, or isn't going to agree, or isn't going to concede anything, others are watching. Others, whether it's reading the op-ed pages or others watching an extended conversation on social media.
I know we're right about out of time, and one other question that I got was that, and I wanted y'all just to go really a quick round robin, is to, I want you to give another book on your topic that you're reading that's really helpful, right? Like, so on that you would suggest alongside your amazing CVs and the work that you're doing, who else are you reading, Monique, on Black, LGBTQ, or abortion and sexuality issues? Who, Mira, are you reading on the Palestinian-Israeli crisis? Who, Andrew, are you reading right now on white Christian nationalism, that is either doing this work as a public intellectual, as a scholar, as an activist, as a community person that you think would really benefit our audience? And then we'll close up right after that. Mira, who are you? We'll start with you, Mira.
I said this last time when I was asked the same question. It's Raja Shahada, Palestinian Walks. Sorry, I think I have it right here. It's very good, and he's personal, and it's daily experience of what it is to live in occupied Palestine.
Thank you so much. Monique?
Yeah, the book isn't out yet, but I'm pushing people to go. I saw the proofs, Brendan Crawley's new book on affirming Black churches.
Yes.
So I'm sending folks there. I got good vibes from it. And with the abortion and activism stuff, I've got stuff laying all over my house. I'd recommend, Toddy's work. I'd recommend, there's an abortion and religion reader that's really good. And also there are two good new books. One is on conceiving, Grace Gow's book, and the other is Risa Cromer's book that's on like what to do with embryos, what Christians are doing with donated embryos.
Oh, wow.
So,
All right. And Andrew, close us out before we talk about next week or next time.
Sure. Well, this isn't a book that I've had a chance to read yet, but I just got it in the mail. What I'm looking forward to is Robert P. Jones, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and a Path Toward a Shared American Future. So his other work I've really enjoyed, White Too Long and The End of White Christian America. So that's one that I'm looking forward to. But there are a lot of good ones that have impacted me deeply, but that's one that's right off the top of my head.
Well, I want to thank you all so much. I want to thank you, Doctors Monique, Andrew, and Mira for joining us this afternoon. This has been a fantastic conversation, and we're going to continue this. We want to think about the ways in which public and engaged scholarship shapes all of our work, our teaching, our engagement, the ways in which we are being shaped and transformed by things that are happening throughout our culture and society. And I hope that you would join us next time on October 26th for our next episode. It's going to be Religion and AI, Artificial Intelligence, for a conversation about the way that folks have been thinking, theorizing, and being affected by that. I thank folks so much. Please check us out on our website. The recording will be live at the end of this week or early next week on YouTube. And there will be a chat, there will be a link to a survey that will be available in the chat, but also it will be sent to you via email. Please fill that out. Let us know what you want to talk about, what you want to hear, and how we can support you and the work that you're doing around the country. Again, thank you all for joining us for this amazing conversation. It's been real. Thanks, Monique, Andrew, and Mira.